Hello and welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you're doing well. Today we are going to be looking at 6 vintage watches, 6 different brands, and 6 very different aesthetics, and I'm very excited to jump into this with you. If you've stumbled onto this video or article, then you clearly have a love for vintage watches. The 6 watches you see are unique in their own right and go way beyond just the aesthetic attractions that each of them has. There are 6 different brands and 6 completely different histories of each of these pieces. We'll start off on the left side here with quite a cool shaped watch. This is, if I can get this camera to focus, this is an Omega reference 511.0474, and it is from the De Ville line from Omega. This Omega De Ville has an extremely unique case shape. The watch was manufactured in 1974. The watch has a gold-plated tank-style case that's in good condition. There are some signs of wear, but there's also some really interesting signs of oxidation to the gold, which you can actually see at the top of the case there. While the watch has a gold-plated case, it does have a stainless steel case back, which you can see there. The watch has this long case with no lugs, as you can see on the back of the watch, and actually sits quite large on the wrist, given the fact that it is a even though it doesn't have any lugs. This was a very typical sort of styling that many brands did in the 1970s to sort of fit in with the groovy aesthetic that this time period had. What's really unique about this watch is you can see that the aperture where the time is displayed is smaller, and so it makes the outer sides of the case stand out a lot larger. The watch has a white dial with Roman numeral hour markers and is in overall really great condition. The watch appears to have its original cabochon crown as well, which I think gives it quite a nice aesthetic and looks very similar to the Piagets and Cartier watches that have become so popular nowadays. This watch runs on the caliber 625 manual wind movement, which was a movement that was produced in many quantities, many of the movements going into ladies' pieces. This was originally sold as a ladies' piece, but I think with its very large, I think it's 42 or 44 or 45 millimeters from top to bottom, it really does sit quite large on the wrist. Let me if you see, and let me just take off the watch that I currently have on before I show you what this watch looks like on the wrist. But as you can see, once this camera focuses on the actual dial of this piece, as you can see, this watch sits quite nicely on the wrist, quite large, very svelte, and fits in with a lot of the watches that have become so popular nowadays. Moving on to the next piece, we'll take a look at this really beautiful Girard Perregaux reference 8194 Gyromatic. This Gyromatics for Girard Perregaux are some of the best vintage automatic movements one can buy, in my view. This watch was manufactured in the 1960s. It has a stainless steel case that is in overall, I think, really wonderful condition given its age. Really quite a beautifully preserved example of this Gyromatic. The case is strong with very little signs of polishing. The lugs are quite sharp on each of the sides, and overall, I think you're just looking at signs of wear on this watch as opposed to maybe over polishing. The watch has moderately sized lugs. You can see they're not the smallest, but they do angle slightly down towards the wrist. It really does fit sort of true to size at about, I think, 34 or 35 millimeters. The watch has a white silver dial that is extremely clean and attractive. This is probably one of the best conditioned Girard Perregaux Gyromatic dials that I've seen in a very long time. It has applied hour markers in a very Rolex Explorer-esk fashion, as you can see with numbers at 6, 9, and 12. The watch also has a date complication at 3 o'clock. A lot of the times collectors avoid date complications because they think it disrupts the dial. What's really nice about this version is there isn't sort of a silver outline of the date window, which allows for it to kind of integrate very seamlessly with the dial and doesn't make it stand out too much. The crown is signed with the GP initials. There are some hairline cracks on the crystal of this watch, but overall, this really is a wonderful example of a gyromatic, and obviously it's running on an automatic gyromatic movement from Girard Perregaux. On the wrist, as I mentioned, it kind of sits true to size. It fits true to size for the most part. The lugs are not extremely large. They don't angle at a very sharp angle towards the wrist either, so overall sits really nicely on the wrist. All right, moving forward, Universal Genève is a brand that I think has always been in sort of the collectors' minds, especially those of us who are interested in vintage watches. But now with the acquisition of the brand by Breitling, the brand is getting a lot more press and a lot more attention by collectors. This Universal Genève was manufactured in 1945. The watch, this is a reference 20508. It has a stainless steel case made of Enver steel and is in fairly good condition. You can see the serial number and the reference on the case back. The case has been polished. You'll notice that the top sort of sides of this case do appear a little bit softer, which are the signs of polishing that I am referring to. If you turn over the watch, the lugs are quite sharp on the underside. I think the polishing really did come. The polishing wheel this watch has seen a polishing wheel definitely on the top of the lug though. But the lugs do still stand out quite strongly and sit quite nicely. The lugs, speaking of the lugs, they're quite long and angle distinctly towards the wrist, and so this watch obviously sits quite true to size, being that it hugs the wrist, but makes it sit quite comfortably. The watch has a white dial that is aged really nicely, as you can see, some really nice patina. You'll notice that there's some nice spotting on the dial, which I think is quite attractive. Some people don't find it attractive, but I think I find it quite attractive. If you look at macro shots we post on our Instagram of this watch, you'll really notice that distinct feature. The watch has radium-filled hour markers and a 24-hour display, so you'll see the 1 to 12 hour markers there that were filled with radium as the luminescent material, and then you'll see the red text around the outside of the larger numbers, which are indicating hours 13 to 24. The watch has really beautifully aged blue steeled hands that match the dial really nicely. Obviously, this is a check that most people do to identify if the hands are original to this watch, and I think that these hands with this dial really do look quite beautiful. The watch has an unsigned crown, which was very typical of Universal Genève watches during this era, and this watch is running on the caliber 267 manual wind movement. On the wrist, as I mentioned, the lugs angle towards the wrist, so it does make the watch sit comfortably on the wrist, probably a little bit smaller than if the lugs were longer, but you can see the fact that the lugs are quite long allow this watch to sit or look a little bit larger on the wrist. All right, halfway there, we'll move on to our next piece. This watch is Quite an astonishing watch in my mind. It was manufactured by Longines in 1942, and this watch has such an interesting case design, which I think is quite unique, and it sort of fits with some of the other pieces that we've covered, especially like the Omega. The watch has a 10-karat gold-filled case manufactured by Star Watch Case Company. You'll see that on the inside caseback as well as on the caseback of the watch. It has if you look at the case, you'll actually see that it's kind of aged into what appears to be sort of a pink tone for this gold. To my knowledge, pink gold plating was not something that was happening by Longines in this era. However, so I believe this to be yellow gold, and it's very typical of yellow gold to sort of fade into a pink hue. The case is slightly curved. You can see from the side of, or the sort of side view of this case, you can see that it curves slightly towards the wrist and has moderate length but quite straight lugs that make the watch sit larger on the wrist. Being that they don't curve so heavily towards the wrist, you really get a few extra millimeters of size. For me, the dial is really where this watch comes to life. As you have likely noticed, the watch had sort of a sunburst dial finishing to it, but it has aged into this pink hue, which really matches the case quite nicely in my mind, and overall has really nice aesthetics to it. It has applied hour markers, thin hands, and a subsidiary seconds dial at 6 o'clock. This watch is running on the caliber 9L manual wind movement, which was an iconic movement for Longines during this era. As I mentioned, the watch, being that the lugs are quite long and flat, allow for this watch to sit a little bit larger on the wrist than if they were curved downwards. Alright, the second to last watch I want to cover is an absolutely phenomenal watch from a design perspective. This is the Bulova right angle in yellow gold. This Bulova was manufactured in 1938. The watch has a 10-karat gold-filled wedge-shaped case, as you can see from the side. That is in overall really good condition. If you look at the sides of the case, you will see that it has this triple step design that adds to its unique design. You can see that from the profile. You'll see the triple steps, and I think it has such a unique and cool shape to it. The case is curved, as you can see, and really hugs the wrist when it's on the wrist, making it an extremely comfortable watch to have on the wrist, just given its interesting case design, but also really well manufactured sort of curved case. The lugs for this watch sort of mimic the wedge shape that I had mentioned previously. As you can see, the lugs on the top of the case are not that long, but if you look at the bottom of the case, they do extend a little bit more outwards from the case. It really just comes down to the fact that it matches the design of this wedge-shaped case. Moving on to the dial, this is an extremely clean dial from 1938. It's really astonishing that this watch, almost 100 years old, has such a clean dial. The watch has a white dial with applied hour markers in an incredibly attractive font, as you can see with the numerals on this dial. It also has a subsidiary seconds dial at 6 o'clock, and the font of the subsidiary seconds is also really interesting. This watch is running on the caliber 9AZ manual wind movement, and in my opinion, this watch is an incredible part of Bulova's history. What's really interesting to me is if this watch was signed Cartier, Piaget, Vacheron Constantin, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, one of those brands, it would be incredibly sought after given the unique design for this watch. On the wrist, this is, as I mentioned, it's an absolute pleasure to wear. It's so cool to see the triple step case on the wrist, and as I mentioned, the fact that this watch is slightly curved allows it to sit so seamlessly on the wrist. In my opinion, one of the best watches that we've been able to find and cover on lifeonthewrist.com. Lastly, this is a piece that I think really comes, if you've been a supporter of Life on the Wrist or followed us for the over 6 years that we've been doing this channel and website, you know that the JLC memory boxes or wrist alarms are an incredibly important part of what I think is some of the best value that you can find in vintage watches and some of the most interesting pieces you can have on the wrist. This watch was manufactured in 1951 by JLC and is the first generation Memovox wrist alarms produced by the brand. When this watch was launched at Basel World in 1951, this was the example, this was the reference that they displayed. This is the reference 3150. The watch has a 35mm stainless steel case that is in overall good condition. There are signs of wear on this watch. You'll see some general wear, just normal to those who wear and enjoy these pieces. What's really unique about the reference 3150 is it has these hooded or tubed lugs, as you can see, which give this watch, this reference, such a unique design to it. Being that these lugs sit on the underside of this watch, the case sits a little bit taller on the wrist than other pieces that you might have worn from the Memovox or wrist alarm line. The watch has a white dial that has aged nicely since the 1950s and has printed text. You will see some aging around this area of the watch quite distinctly. Both the alarm disc and outer dial match really nicely in patina, and you can see some moisture spots. Again, some people will find it attractive, some people will not. The watch has sword hands that are likely a replacement. You can see the luminescent material doesn't quite match with the tone of the rest of the dial. The crowns are unsigned. These pieces typically came with signed crowns, so those are likely replacements as well. The watch is running on the famous caliber P489 manual wind alarm movement, and obviously the alarm is sounding absolutely phenomenally. What's really interesting about this piece is that this isn't the first time that JLC used these sort of tubed lugs on some of their watches. There are some time-only pieces that use this design, but JLC quickly moved away from these tubed lugs and moved to sort of the traditional straight lugs that you see on a lot more of the Memovoxes or wrist alarms that you have likely seen and we've covered on the channel. One of my favorite pieces that we've definitely been able to cover, and I think this really shows you a really nice array of vintage watches and some of the pieces that you really speak to what is important here at Life on the Wrist. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at these 6 vintage watches. As I mentioned, these are, it's so cool when you are into vintage watches because there are so many years of history that each of these brands have, and each of these brands during that time period they were trying to gain more and more buyers, and to do that they were innovating. They were innovating, whether it was in design, whether it was in case material, in the way that they laid out their dials, or if we go beyond that and we think about the innovation that they were trying to come up with when it came to the movements that they were manufacturing, they were really just trying to attract more and more buyers. And with all of those years of history, you get so many different pieces that allow you as a collector to experience so many different aesthetics and brands. And I really think it's a perfect example of why watch collecting is a journey. You can't go straight into it because there's so much that you probably have not seen before. These 6 pieces are amazing. For me, I think the 2 standouts for me was the last piece that I spoke about, which was the reference 3150 from JLC, the alarm piece. For me, having this piece is really significant, being that on the channel I've covered many different Memovoxes or wrist alarms, but I've also been a huge advocate for the fact that I think this is some of the coolest technology, some of the coolest and most attractive vintage watches that you can possibly get. And having the original reference to cover, I think, is really exciting. Obviously, you know, we've done many videos about these pieces, but for me, just an absolute, honestly, it's an honor to be able to cover this. So this was definitely one of my favorites. And then, to be honest, I've really been, like, my breath has been taken away by this incredible Bulova right angle. The design of this case, the triple stepped sides, the incredibly clean dial, just everything about this watch. Everything about this watch works, and to be from 1938, I think, is even more incredible, and I think shows the longevity of some of these pieces and the designs that these brands came up with during those eras. As always, we are going to be going in depth on each of these pieces, so stay tuned for that. We'll have articles and videos for each of them, so you'll be able to see some of these pieces more in the metal, and as well see some of the pictures of these watches. As always, there will be an article for this video, though. If you want to see more pictures of these pieces, there will be the first link in the description of this video will be to the article for this video, so you can see the pieces, read about them a little bit more, and see some pictures of each of the watches. Let me know in the comment section below which of these pieces excited you the most, which of the pieces would you be interested in having me cover first, or perhaps you know, maybe you have one of these. I'd love to hear about that too. If you are new to Life on the Wrist, be sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who might be interested in watches. If you wouldn't mind liking this video, it really does help me out. With that said, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time.